Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the software your entire business depends on could disappear. Not because of a technical failure, but because of geopolitics. For decades, the global technology industry operated on an assumption that software platforms would remain widely available regardless of political tensions. But in 2019, that assumption was challenged when Huawei, one of the world's largest technology companies, suddenly found itself cut off from critical American technologies. What followed wasn't just a corporate crisis. It became one of the most ambitious technology rebuilding projects of the modern era. Today, Huawei's efforts have expanded far beyond smartphones. The company is now attempting to build an entire software ecosystem that spans phones, tablets, wearable devices, cars, and increasingly, personal computers. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds remains uncertain, but it has already changed an important global conversation. The question is no longer whether Huawei survived. The question is whether its response could influence how countries think about technological independence for decades to come. To understand why, we need to go back to May 2019. That month, the US Department of Commerce placed Huawei on its entity list, a measure that restricted American companies from supplying certain technologies without government approval. According to the Department of Commerce, the policy reflected national security concerns and significantly altered Huawei's access to key components of the global technology ecosystem. One of the most immediate consequences involved Google. Outside China, Android smartphones typically depend on Google mobile services, the software package that includes the Google Play Store, Gmail, Google Maps, YouTube, and numerous background services that millions of users rely on every day. Although Huawei could still use the open source version of Android, new devices could no longer ship with Google's proprietary services. For many international customers, that dramatically reduced the appeal of Huawei smartphones. At roughly the same time, export restrictions also complicated Huawei's long-term access to advanced processors supplied by American companies such as Intel and AMD. While existing business relationships continued in some areas through licenses and evolving regulations, the broader direction had become increasingly uncertain. For Huawei, this wasn't simply about losing software. It was about losing confidence in depending on technology that could become unavailable because of political decisions beyond the company's control. Most companies confronted with such circumstances would likely focus on restoring previous partnerships. Huawei chose another strategy entirely. Rather than waiting for geopolitical conditions to improve, the company accelerated work on an operating system that had quietly been under development for years. In August 2019, Huawei officially introduced HarmonyOS. The announcement attracted global attention, but it also generated skepticism. Technology analysts quickly observed that the earliest version still relied heavily on the Android open source project. Critics argued that HarmonyOS looked more like an adaptation of Android than an entirely new operating system. Based on the evidence available at the time, those criticisms were understandable. However, Huawei consistently described that first release as only the beginning of a much longer roadmap. According to Huawei's official developer documentation, the company's long-term objective was never simply to replace Android on smartphones. The broader vision was to build an operating system capable of connecting multiple categories of devices through a unified software architecture. That kind of ambition sounds straightforward. In reality, it represents one of the most difficult engineering challenges in modern computing. Designing an operating system is only the first step. Developers must create applications. Businesses need compatible productivity software. Governments require secure infrastructure. Universities need educational tools. Consumers expect familiar apps, reliable performance, and seamless updates. History shows that successful operating systems are not built solely through code. They are built through ecosystems. Microsoft spent decades building Windows into the world's dominant desktop platform. Apple carefully integrated macOS with the iPhone, iPad, Apple Watch, and other products to create a unified experience. Google expanded Android from smartphones into televisions, smartwatches, automobiles, and connected home devices. Huawei faced the challenge of building a comparable ecosystem while simultaneously adapting to export controls and shifting geopolitical conditions. That made the project considerably more complex. Instead of attempting a rapid transformation, Huawei adopted a gradual approach. Over the next 5 years, engineers reportedly redesigned major portions of the software platform, reducing dependence on Android's open-source framework while encouraging developers to build applications specifically for HarmonyOS. The result arrived in 2024. Huawei introduced HarmonyOS NEXT, describing it as a fully independent operating system that no longer relies on Android's open-source codebase. According to Huawei's official technical documentation, HarmonyOS NEXT was designed around a native architecture intended to support smartphones, tablets, wearable devices, smart home products, connected vehicles, and eventually personal computers through a single operating environment. From a technological perspective, this marked an important milestone. From a strategic perspective, it may have been even more significant. Because HarmonyOS was no longer just competing with Android, it was beginning to compete with an entire software ecosystem. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question in this story. If Huawei could build an operating system capable of powering phones, tablets, watches, and vehicles, what would stop it from expanding to the one platform that has remained remarkably stable for nearly 4 decades? The personal computer. That question shifts the discussion from smartphones to something much larger. Because once HarmonyOS entered the PC market, the conversation was no longer simply about Huawei. It became a conversation about Microsoft's Windows, one of the most successful software platforms in history, and whether changing geopolitical priorities could eventually reshape one of the world's most established computing ecosystems. The personal computer has remained one of the most stable segments of the technology industry for decades. While smartphones have seen fierce competition between Apple, Samsung, Google, and numerous Chinese manufacturers, the desktop operating system market has been remarkably consistent. Microsoft Windows still powers the overwhelming majority of business computers around the world, supported by decades of software compatibility, enterprise infrastructure, and developer investment. Replacing that kind of dominance is extraordinarily difficult. An operating system is much more than the interface users see on a screen. Banks rely on specialized software built for Windows. Hospitals manage patient records through Windows-based systems. Schools, manufacturers, logistics companies, and government agencies often operate applications that have been refined over many years. Switching platforms means retraining employees, migrating sensitive data, updating cybersecurity procedures, and ensuring thousands of business applications continue to function reliably. This is why operating systems rarely change overnight. But sometimes, history creates unexpected opportunities. China is the world's largest personal computer market. According to industry analysts at IDC and Canalys, millions of computers are replaced every year as organizations modernize their technology infrastructure. At the same time, Microsoft's published Windows lifecycle policies have encouraged businesses worldwide to evaluate upgrades as older versions approach the end of support. For Chinese policymakers, that upgrade cycle coincides with a broader national objective. Over the past several years, Beijing has increasingly encouraged the adoption of domestic technologies in strategic sectors, particularly where long-term technological resilience is considered important. Huawei's investment in HarmonyOS arrived at precisely the moment when many organizations were already preparing to refresh their computing systems. This does not mean Microsoft is about to lose its global leadership. Far from it. Windows remains deeply embedded across international markets, and decades of software compatibility provide advantages that cannot be replicated in only a few years. However, Huawei's strategy may not require global dominance to be successful. If HarmonyOS gains meaningful adoption within China's domestic market, it could create a sufficiently large ecosystem to attract developers, enterprise software providers, and hardware manufacturers. Success in one of the world's largest technology markets could provide the scale necessary to strengthen the platform over time. That possibility extends beyond China itself. Huawei has continued expanding its products across parts of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, regions where the company already maintains significant telecommunications infrastructure and long-standing commercial relationships. According to Huawei's public market strategy, these regions remain important areas for future ecosystem growth. Whether HarmonyOS becomes widely adopted in those markets remains uncertain. Consumer preferences, application availability, regulatory environments, and local competition will all influence its future. Yet one broader trend is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Around the world, governments are placing greater emphasis on what policymakers often describe as technological sovereignty or digital resilience, the ability to maintain essential digital infrastructure without depending entirely on external suppliers. That conversation extends far beyond Huawei. It includes semiconductors, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, cybersecurity, telecommunications, and increasingly, operating systems. Recent years have shown that technology is no longer viewed solely as a commercial product. It has become an important element of national strategy. Huawei's experience illustrates that transformation. The company responded to export restrictions by attempting to build an independent technology stack, from hardware to software and connected devices. Whether every part of that strategy ultimately succeeds is still an open question. But its broader significance is already influencing discussions well beyond China's borders. As Counterpoint Research has noted in its analysis of Huawei's recovery, the company's recent progress demonstrates how sustained investment can reshape competitive dynamics, even under significant external constraints. At the same time, industry analysts emphasize that building a successful software ecosystem requires years of developer support, consumer trust, and enterprise adoption. Those challenges remain substantial. Microsoft continues to possess one of the strongest software ecosystems ever created. Apple continues integrating hardware and software with exceptional efficiency. Google continues expanding Android across billions of connected devices worldwide. Huawei enters this landscape as a new competitor facing enormous technical and commercial hurdles. So the future is far from decided. But perhaps that is the most important lesson of this story. 5 years ago, many observers believed Huawei's technology ambitions had reached a dead end. Instead, the company used that moment as an opportunity to rethink its long-term strategy. Rather than rebuilding the past, it attempted to build an alternative future. Whether HarmonyOS ultimately becomes a major global operating system is still uncertain. What is becoming increasingly clear, however, is that the global technology industry is entering an era where resilience, diversification, and technological independence are becoming just as important as innovation itself. And that may prove to be Huawei's most lasting contribution. Not simply another operating system, but a new model for how countries and companies respond when access to critical technologies can no longer be taken for granted. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe for more documentaries exploring the intersection of geopolitics, technology, economics, and global strategy. I'm Professor Jiang Xueqin. Thank you for watching.